Parking lot looked like a museum of money. Bentleys, Rolls Royces, Hawk and a Lamborghini, the color of midnight sitting between two Porsches like it belonged there. Flatly, in dark vests moved between them with the practiced ease of people who had stopped being impressed by expensive things a long time ago. Truck arrived. Old, scratched, the kind of vehicle that carries its history on the outside, every dent a date, every rust bloom a year. Rolled in slowly, no hurry, like it had been here before and knew exactly where it was going. Flies stopped moving. A door opened, one man stepped out. Jeans, simple jacket, worn boots, nothing that announced anything. 200 people turned to look. Some laughed. Some pulled out their phones, halting in. One woman, standing near the fountain in a white gown, went completely still, her smile frozen somewhere between recognition and something she hadn't expected to feel tonight. Nobody understood yet what they were actually looking at. People. People always think heartbreak starts the moment someone says the words. It doesn't. Heartbreak starts earlier. Much earlier. It starts in the small moments you almost missed. The dinner where she laughed at something on her phone instead of at something you said. The Friday night where she checked the time twice before the food even arrived. The morning she looked at your truck in the driveway and didn't say anything. Laced. Just looked, then looked away. My name is Anthony Wilson, and 3 years before the night I drove that rusted pickup through the gates of the most expensive engagement party I'd ever seen in my life, I genuinely believed I had everything a man could want. Not everything money could buy, everything that mattered. I had a woman who used to reach for my hand without thinking about it. A home we picked together, small enough that you could hear each other from any room. A career I'd built from scratch, real engineering work, the kind where your hands understand what your calculations are saying before your brain catches up. And that truck, old, dented, scarred, in a stubborn, beautiful truck, my father helped me inspect before I signed the papers. Both of us, crouched in the parking lot of a dealership in Decatur, while he knocked on the wheel wells and said, she's solid. Ugly, but solid. Then looked at me with a half smile like he wasn't just talking about the vehicle. Harold Reed didn't say much, never did, but when he spoke you filed it away. I filed all of it away. Growing up in East Atlanta, our house smelled like motor oil and cornbread and whatever Harold was fixing in the garage on any given Saturday. He was a welder for 31 years, worked for a fabrication company, out near Hapeville, woke up at 5 every morning, came home with burn marks on his forearms and sawdust in his hair, ate dinner, and then went back into that garage to fix things for neighbors who couldn't afford to pay anyone else, charged them. Not once. My mother used to say he was giving away money they didn't have. Harold would look at her over the dinner table and say, "I'm not giving away money, I'm building something." She'd shake her head. He'd go back to the garage. I didn't understand what he meant until I was much older. He wasn't building objects. He was building a reputation so quiet and so deep that it had no bottom. Kind of reputation that doesn't make headlines, doesn't get plaques, spreads, person to person, handshake to handshake, until 20 years later a man you've never met tells you he knew your father and says it the way people say they knew someone important. That's what Harold Reed built, and somewhere between watching him work and watching him refuse to complain about it, I decided I wanted to build something too. Same thing. Something of my own, something that had my name on it, even if nobody could see the name yet. I got a full scholarship to Georgia Tech, engineering, the kind of program that culls the herd by midterms, leaves the survivors blinking at each other in hallways wondering which version of themselves made it through. I made it through, because I was the smartest person in every room. I wasn't, but I outworked almost everyone I met, and the ones I couldn't outwork I learned from. That's a skill Harold gave me without ever calling it a skill. I graduated, got hired, started working my way up inside a mid-sized construction firm in Atlanta, the kind of company that handles the contracts that are too small for the giants and too complex for the rookies. It was good work, honest work, the kind where you see the building go up and you know your numbers are inside the walls, holding everything together, invisible and essential. I was 29 years old and I thought I had figured out the trajectory. I met Vanessa Carter, and I realized I hadn't figured out anything yet. It was a community volunteer event in Midtown, one of those Saturday afternoon things where people show up with good intentions and clipboards, and nobody's quite sure who's in charge. Luncheon. I was there because a colleague from work had dragged me along, and then disappeared into a conversation about zoning laws within the first 10 minutes. Vanessa was there because she actually wanted to be, which was immediately obvious from the way she was moving through the room, like she had a purpose and a deadline, and no patience for anyone standing still. But she had a stack of printed materials under one arm, a pen behind her ear, and she was walking too fast for the floor plan, and she knew it and kept going anyway. The stack shifted, then slipped, Luchan inner. Then the whole thing went sideways and hit the floor in a spread that covered about 6 square feet of community center linoleum. Luchan inner. She stood there looking at it, not panicking, not embarrassed, just doing the quick math on whether it was worth picking it all up or starting over. I was already crouching down before I made a conscious decision to do it. Started stacking papers back into order. Luchan inner. She crouched down across from me, and we worked in opposite directions until everything was back in a pile, slightly crooked, mostly there. Thank you, she said. Direct. Like she meant it but wasn't going to perform it. No problem, I said. She looked at me for a second. Not evaluating, just looking the way people do when they're actually paying attention. Then she said, you stacked those by category. Black down at the pile. I hadn't noticed I was doing it. Force of habit. What's the habit? Engineering. She tilted her head just slightly. You do that to everything? Most things. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile yet, but close. That must be exhausting. Only when things are already organized, and there it was, a smile. Wide and sudden and completely real, the kind that takes over a person's face before they can decide whether to let it. Luchan inner. She laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that doesn't calculate itself, doesn't perform for a room, just happens. We stood there for the next 40 minutes talking, Luchan in. About the event, about Atlanta, about what it felt like to grow up in a city that keeps changing its face every 5 years, and whether that was progress or just a different kind of erasure. He was sharp. Not performed sharpness, not the kind that's looking for applause, the kind that just processes things faster than average, and isn't particularly interested in hiding it. By the time my colleague found me again, Vanessa and I had exchanged numbers, made a tentative plan for coffee the following Wednesday. Light, and I had a feeling that was new enough to be slightly alarming. Coffee became dinner. The dinner became a habit. The habit became a year. Barton. In the spring, patch of grass in Piedmont Park, under a white oak tree that had been growing there since before either of us existed. Lesson. I asked her to marry me with a ring I'd spent 3 months saving for. Lickliner. Not because it was expensive, but because I'd picked it carefully. Block. The way I picked everything. Block me. And I wanted her to know the difference. Lanchan in A. She was crying before I finished asking. Yes, she said. Just yes. And she said it like it wasn't a decision she was making, more like something she'd already known and was finally saying out loud. Those years were the best of my life. I mean that without qualification. We were not rich, not even close. We lived in a house in Decatur that was small enough to feel full even when only one of us was home, bleating inner. We couldn't afford the vacation she sometimes mentioned, couldn't afford the furniture we saw in showrooms, and photographed as a joke about the future, like Nina. Every Friday evening, we bought takeout from the Thai place 2 streets over, sat on the front porch even in the cold, talked about what we wanted, what we were building, where we were going. They wanted a beautiful home someday. Lidden, a real one. Porch, wide enough to mean something. Kitchen with actual counter space, a yard. Told her I was working toward it. She wanted to drive across the country. I told her we'd do that too. Whenever money was tight, I'd look at her and say, Lamine, give me time. Playaku, and she'd smile and say, Lenchanina, you always say that. Talking, and I'd say, like, and I always come through. Lachanine, and she'd shake her head like she was pretending to be more skeptical than she was. She believed me then. That's the part that sits with me. Even now, she believed me. And then something shifted, slowly and quietly and completely, until she didn't anymore. The first signs were small enough that I almost categorized them as nothing. Almost. Tension. Vanessa started spending more time on her phone in the evenings. Not texting, scrolling. Litane. She'd found a group of accounts on Instagram and TikTok that posted about what she called black excellence, play, which was a phrase I had no argument with, until I understood that in this specific context, it meant primarily young couples in expensive houses, with expensive cars, taking expensive vacations, and presenting the whole arrangement as a personality, luxury as identity, acquisition as aspiration. She followed more of them, then more. Then she started watching longer videos, the kind that were essentially extended advertisements dressed up as lifestyle content, tension in her. And slowly, the way water finds its way through concrete, the imagery started changing the way she talked about our life. It wasn't a sudden shift. That's what I want to be clear about. Because the story is easier to tell if there's a moment, a single before and after. Uchan inner. There wasn't. It was incremental. One comment at dinner about a couple she'd seen online who owned a condo in Buckhead at 28. One observation about a friend of a friend who'd just gotten a new car. Like-rinner, one question. Quiet and genuinely curious sounding. Plat. About whether I'd ever considered going after bigger contracts. Fly and higher paying positions. Something with more upward velocity. I didn't read those comments as indictments. Luncheon. Not at first. I read them as ambition, which I respected. I had ambition, I was working hard. I was taking on extra contracts on weekends, putting in longer hours at the firm, doing the work that positioned me for the next level. I thought we were on the same page about patience, about building things the right way. I was wrong about what page she was on. Listener. The comment that I still think about, the one that settled into me like a stone dropping into still water, and never fully surfacing again, came on a Tuesday evening in November. Pensioner. I'd worked 14 hours straight on a structural analysis that had been giving me problems for a week. I came home and put a small velvet box on the kitchen counter. Inside was a necklace, delicate gold chain with a small pendant, blushing, extravagant, locking. But something I'd noticed her pause in front of in a shop window 2 months earlier, and then keep walking, fly the way she did when she wanted something and didn't want to want it, in the box. Looked at it, beautiful. Lekkener, she said, Lokner, and she meant it. Tell. She meant it. Liaton. After a beat, lying's almost to herself. Ultony. I wish someday you could buy me something from Tiffany's. Orchanina. She didn't say it to hurt me. I'm certain of that. It came out the way things come out when you've been thinking something for a long time and your filter slips for just a second. But certain or not, it landed. Pensionina. And once something lands like that, you can't unfeel it. From that night forward, I heard a subtext in conversations that hadn't been there before. Or maybe it had always been there, and I'd been choosing not to hear it. I couldn't tell anymore. Inner. What I could tell was that we were no longer talking about a shared future in the same language. Larsen. She was using a vocabulary of arrival, of having made it, of visible proof. I was still speaking in the language of process, of foundation, of the long game. Those are two different conversations. They can sound the same for a while, then they can't. Light inner. She started attending networking events, business galas, charity dinners, the kind of rooms where people hand each other cards and talk about deals that may or may not be real but sound expensive either way. First, she invited me. I went a few times. I wore the nicest clothes I owned. I shook hands and made conversation. But I was aware in that particular way that makes your skin register temperature differently, that I was being assessed, not by everyone, but by some people, pensioner. And Vanessa was aware of how I was being assessed, and that awareness was starting to cost her something I could see but not quite name. Pensioner. Then she stopped inviting me. She said the environment wasn't really my kind of thing, said I'd be bored, said it was mostly just industry networking and I wouldn't know anyone. I let it go the first few times, because I trusted her, because we had a marriage and a home and a Friday evening ritual, and I believed those things meant something durable. I should have paid more attention to the dress. She came home one evening in something I'd never seen, a deep burgundy cocktail dress with a cut that suggested it hadn't come from a sale rack. She set her bag down in the kitchen, and I looked at the dress and said, "That's new." Accusatory, observational. "I found it on sale," she said. Moving to the refrigerator. Not looking at me. Something about the cadence of that answer made me check our joint account that night. The charge was there. The amount was not what the word sale implies. Brought it up the next morning. Gently, trying to make it a practical conversation about budgeting, rather than an accusation. She went defensive the way people do when they know they're wrong, and have already decided they're not going to admit it. You always have to question everything. Her voice edged. I'm not questioning, I'm asking. There's a difference between asking and interrogating, Anthony. I asked one question. You asked it the way you ask it, and that was the thing. I didn't have a good response to that because it wasn't entirely untrue. Also, it wasn't the point. And we both knew the point was the dress and the account, and the fact that she hadn't told me, said any of that. We just argued around the edges of it until we were both tired and went to bed without saying anything that mattered. The arguments became regular after that, not every night, but often enough that the quiet evening started feeling like pauses between arguments rather than the natural texture of a marriage. The Friday takeout on the porch happened less. When it did happen, we talked less. I started noticing which silences were comfortable and which ones weren't, and the ratio was changing in the wrong direction. One night she looked at me from across the dinner table, and there was something in her expression I hadn't seen before. Not anger, not even disappointment exactly, more like assessment, like she was running numbers. Honestly think this is the life I deserve. Her voice was level, that was the worst part. Not heated, level. I set down my fork. What do you mean? Plain inner. She gestured, a small movement that somehow encompassed the kitchen, planchen inner the house, truck. Visible through the window, for everything, bliss. Our little house, your old truck, Leetin inner. The same routine month after month. I thought we'd be somewhere by now, Anthony. I thought we'd have become something. I wanted to tell her that we were somewhere. Lodging inner. That we were two people who'd built a life together from nothing, and that the life had more substance in it than the curated images she'd been measuring us against. Listen, I wanted to say that meaningful things don't have a 2-year deadline, that the infrastructure of a real life takes longer than a highlight reel suggests. I wanted to say all of that. Instead I said, I understand, inner. And then, because I was tired and because part of me didn't understand, really, not really, version of Vanessa I thought I'd married, last. Nodded. Quietly. Let the moment pass. That was one of my mistakes. The nodding, the letting it pass. I was trying to be steady. I was confusing steadiness with silence, and silence with acceptance. And she may have read my quiet as agreement that she was right. She was not right. I never quite said so. That was a few weeks before she introduced me to Jeffrey Lewis. But she mentioned him first as a contact. Talking. She'd met at one of those networking events. Businessman, pensioner successful, pension, who was doing charitable work with some of the same organizations she'd gotten involved with, inner. She described him the way people describe someone they're being careful about describing, technically accurate, line, nothing left out, Russian, and yet somehow the portrait had been arranged, inner. I noticed the arrangement but said nothing. When I met him in person, the arrangement made more sense. Jeffrey Lewis was 44 years old, and had the particular bearing of a man who had spent a long time understanding exactly what impression he was making. Tailored suit. Dark charcoal. Not flashy but expensive in the specific way that only registers if you know what you're looking at. Fashion. Watch on his left wrist that wasn't ostentatious but was not discreet either. He owned a chain of luxury car dealerships across Metro Atlanta, had his name on a couple of real estate investments, and moved through rooms like he was entitled to the square footage. Plugged my hand the first time with a grip that was exactly 1 degree too firm. Kind of grip that's communicating something it doesn't want to say out loud. I've heard a lot about you, Anthony. Vanessa says you're very hardworking, not talented, not brilliant, not driven, hardworking. Uchine. The word you use for someone who runs on effort rather than gifts. The word that acknowledges labor without crediting vision. That's kind of her, I said. They smiled. No, I mean it, I respect that. Not everyone is cut out for, the corporate path. I looked at him, he was still smiling. Luncheon. Vanessa was standing slightly to his left and slightly behind him, in a position that is technically beside someone but communicates something more differential than beside. I noticed that too. I'm not on the corporate path, I said. I'm an engineer. Right. Like that was a subset of what he'd already said. Good for you. The conversation moved on. He was smooth at moving conversations on. Lawson. That's a specific skill, the ability to deposit a comment that does a particular kind of damage, and then shift the topic before anyone can respond to the damage directly. Distat. I watched him work the room for the next hour, and recognized the technique repeated with different targets. But it was the way he looked at Vanessa that bothered me most. Not the obvious way, not obviously possessive, or obviously inappropriate. Inner. More like he'd already made a decision that she didn't know she'd agreed to yet. Light and inner. The look of someone who believes the outcome is settled and is simply managing the timeline. I drove home that night and sat in the truck in the driveway for a few minutes after I turned the engine off. Just sat there with my hands on the steering wheel in the dark, with the particular silence that comes right after the engine goes quiet. Wasn't afraid yet. But I was paying a different kind of attention. His name started appearing in conversations more frequently. Jeffrey this, Jeffrey that, lit. His charity work, Luntina, his business dinners, Bree's perspective on the real estate market, Hutchin, the event he'd hosted at his house in Buckhead, that Vanessa attended for networking, and stayed at until almost midnight. Like she had an explanation for every mention. Each explanation was technically plausible. Together they formed a pattern that was not. I tried to talk to her about it directly once. I chose my words carefully, I wasn't accusatory. Tension inner. I asked whether she felt like things had changed between us. Whether there was something she needed from the marriage that she wasn't getting. Whether we could talk about it openly. Tension inner. She told me I was being paranoid. Told me I needed to trust her. Told me that I was making something out of nothing, because I was insecure about my career and projecting it onto her relationships. That last part hit differently than she probably intended. Not because it was true, but because the confidence with which she said it, me, the speed, practiced, quality of it, told me she'd rehearsed the defense. Inner. You don't rehearse defenses for accusations that haven't been made yet, unless you know they're coming. The night everything stopped, a Tuesday in late February, she came home and sat down at the dinner table and didn't say anything for a long time. Food was already there, something I'd made that was getting cold, or wasn't looking at it, and wasn't looking at me. Tension inner. Just looking at the center of the table with the expression of someone who has been rehearsing a speech. and is now trying to remember the first line. Waited. I was good at waiting. Harold had taught me that too, whether he'd meant to or not. Anthony. Her voice was quiet, not unkind, which in some ways was worse. I looked at her. I don't think we're right for each other anymore. The room went very still. Inner. I remember the specific quality of the silence. How the refrigerator hum seemed louder than it had any right to be. How the clock on the wall sounded like it was taking more time between ticks than physics should allow. Inner. I asked the question that every person in my position asks. The question you already know the answer to but need to hear confirmed because some terrible part of you still thinks maybe you're wrong. Is there someone else? She didn't answer immediately. Lie, that pause, 2 seconds. Flinging, maybe 3. Lying was the most information she had given me in months. Leaving, she said, for him. It wasn't a question by the time I said it. She nodded small. Once, I closed my eyes not to cry. I was not crying. Inner. I was doing the thing Harold did when something hit hard. The internal calibration. The deliberate choice about what to let in and what to hold at the border, until you could process it without burning the room down. Inner. When I opened them, she was still looking at the center of the table. I hope he gives you what you're looking for, I said. I mean that. She looked at me then. Actually looked like she'd been expecting something else and was recalibrating. That's all you're going to say? Would you like me to say? She didn't answer. Parting. I think she wanted me to fight. To yell, to beg, to make some dramatic declaration that would let her feel the weight of what she was ending. I understood the impulse, even in that moment. It would have been easier for her if I'd fallen apart. It would have confirmed a story. I didn't give her the story. I stood up. Inner. Walked into the bedroom. I didn't slam anything. I packed one bag. The essentials. The things you pack when you're not sure when you're coming back but you're certain you're leaving tonight. Light. Then I walked back through the kitchen, lying where she was still sitting at the table, eating Inner. And I went out the front door and got into my truck and drove away from the house on Eastview, line which I had helped paint and had installed crown molding in myself, on a long weekend in July, and had considered the physical proof that we were building something real. I didn't look back. Some people told me later that I gave up too easily. They didn't understand. Love is not proven by forcing someone to stay, but staying when someone has already left, chasing them from room to room, trying to change their mind, earning their choice, into a siege they have to escape. Lacking, that's not love. Inner. That's possession. And I had been raised by a man who understood the difference between holding something and trapping it. Let her go. The divorce was finalized 4 months later. Inner. I stood outside the courthouse in downtown Atlanta on a Thursday afternoon in June, while a taxi moved through traffic on Pryor Street, and a group of office workers passed me on the sidewalk, laughing about something I couldn't hear. Inner. Vanessa walked out with Jeffrey Lewis, and they moved toward a waiting car, and she was already talking to him before they reached the curb. He didn't look back either. That symmetry did not escape me. I got into my truck, drove home. Home was now a room in a building in College Park, $650 a month, not including utilities, lacking, with a radiator that clanked once every hour. On the hour like it was keeping its own schedule, and a window that faced a parking lot, and a bed frame I'd picked up secondhand, because the alternative was sleeping on the floor, and I had enough dignity left to decline that option. First 3 weeks were the kind of bad that doesn't announce itself dramatically. It was quiet bad. I went to work, I did my job. I answered emails. Inner. I sat in meetings and contributed the appropriate things, and then drove home and sat in that room with the clanking radiator and the parking lot view, and did not eat at the right times and did not sleep at the right times, and told everyone who asked that I was fine, Leshen. Which was not a lie so much as a shorthand for something too complicated to explain to someone who hadn't earned the right to the full version. One Saturday night in late July I drove without any destination, just drove. Atlanta at night has a particular quality, lacking, the way the lights spread out across the flatness of it, Ocean, the way certain neighborhoods hum and others go quiet, Plane, the way the highway feels like something separate from the city it runs through. Drove for almost an hour before I understood where I was going. Parked 2 houses down from Eastview. Turned the engine off. Sat there. The lights were on inside. Both floors. The porch light too, which we had almost never used because the bulb was yellow and we'd always meant to replace it and never did. Someone had replaced it. Light was white now. Clean. I sat in the truck and looked at the house for a long time. Inner. Long enough that I understood sitting there was its own kind of decision, not a healthy one. Then I turned the key and the engine came back to life, and I drove away from Eastview for the last time. On the way back at a red light on Memorial Drive, my phone rang. Harold Reed, at 11:15 at night. My father, who went to bed at 9:30 and woke at 5:15 with the regularity of a mechanism, calling at 11:15 on a Saturday. I answered. Son, just that, not a question. A presence. I didn't say anything for a moment. Tension in her. There was something about hearing his voice in that particular combination of tired and raw that made the back of my throat tighten in a way I had been successfully preventing for 3 weeks. I heard, he said. Don't need you to explain it. I already know enough. The light turned green. I pulled forward. I know right now you probably don't want to hear anything, Harold said. When your mother left, I didn't want to hear anything either. I wanted everyone to leave me alone for about a year. A pause. Lied. I'm not going to leave you alone for a year. I'll say one thing and then let you go. I kept driving. Don't let this make you small, he said. Pain. This size can go 2 ways. It can shrink you down until you fit inside it, or you can grow around it until it's just something you carry, not something you are. That choice is yours, Anthony. Hers. Not his. Yours. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because anything I said would have broken something I wasn't ready to break yet. Drive safe, he said, and he hung up. I held the phone for a second at the next red light, Honcheninner. Set it in the cup holder, and sat with his words in the way you sit with something that's too large to process immediately and too important to set aside. 3 months. After the divorce was final, I had rebuilt something that wasn't quite a life yet, but had the frame of one. I was still in College Park, still at the firm, still doing the work, platting A. But in the evenings, instead of sitting with the radiator in the parking lot and the weight of what had happened, I had started writing. Brief. Not processing in any recognizable therapeutic sense, plans, actual engineering plans, structured around an idea I had been developing for almost 5 years, and never quite committed to, because there had always been a reason to wait, blocking a safer moment, lasting a more stable season. Honcheninner. There was no more stable season coming. I understood that now. The core of the idea was a structure optimization system I had built inside the firm's projects, without anyone understanding it was mine. Methodology for reducing material costs in commercial construction by recalculating load distribution in ways that existing software wasn't accounting for. 30% cost reduction, sometimes more, without any compromise to structural integrity. Honcheninner. I had run it on every project I touched for the past 3 years. The results were in the buildings. No one had asked who was responsible because no one had known to ask. Was mine. Completely, provably, documentably mine. And I had been giving it away for years. I called Darnell Cooper on a Thursday night. Lesson. We had been friends since sophomore year at Georgia Tech, graduated the same year, different directions, into adjacent industries, plunge in, and maintained the kind of friendship that could survive 18 months of silence, and resume without losing any altitude. He was a CPA now, sharp and blunt in equal measure, the kind of person who tells you things you don't want to hear with the same expression he uses to discuss the weather. You need to come over, I said when he picked up. Tonight? No. This weekend. I have something I want to show you. A pause. Honcheninner. Darnell's pauses were always doing something. Does this have anything to do with the divorce? Indirectly. Is this a good idea thing or a grief project thing? Because those look the same at first and they're not. Come over Saturday. Talk and decide which one it is after you've seen it. He was quiet for another moment. Fine. Saturday. 7. I'm not bringing food. I'm not asking you to bring food. Good. Because I wasn't going to. Honcheninner. He arrived at 7 exactly, which was how Darnell operated, and sat at my second-hand table in the College Park room with a radiator, and looked at the documents I spread out in front of him without saying anything for almost 20 minutes. Questions. Good ones. The kind that probed the structure of an idea, not just the surface. I answered each one. He went back to the documents. Read sections again. Sat back. This is real, he said finally. I know it's real. I built it. Like. No, I mean, this is actually real, Anthony. Brief. Project. Passion. This is a business. He picked up one of the, you've been giving this away. I know. To a company that doesn't know you exist outside of your job description. I know, that's. He set the page down. That's actually something of a problem, which is why I'm not doing it anymore. Honcheninner. He looked at me across the table for a long moment. Darnell had a way of assessing things that was almost physical, like he was running a hand along the surface of a decision to feel for cracks. You understand this can fail completely, he said. Yes. You have almost no capital. Correct. And no backup plan. Formal one. He was quiet. I could see him doing the calculation, not just the financial one. The whole thing, the timing, the state I was in, the room, the radiator which chose that moment to clank. Then Monday. 7 p.m. Bring this, all of it, blow through everything. He started gathering his jacket. Promising anything. I'm saying I'll look. That's all I'm asking. And Anthony. He paused at the door. Whatever this started as, whether it started from the right place or from the thing that happened with Vanessa, it doesn't matter anymore. What's in those papers is real. Pulled something real. He left. The room went quiet again. Leishan. Just me and the radiator and the parking lot and the document spread across the table under a lamp I'd bought at a Goodwill in East Point. I looked down at those pages for a long time. Then I started organizing them. By category. By order of presentation. By strongest argument first, supporting evidence second, financial projections third, force of habit, pension inner. I didn't know then what those pages would become. I didn't know about the contract in Charlotte or the investors in Savannah, or the glass building in Midtown, or the 47 people who would one day work inside it, pension inner. I didn't know about the Ferrari or the truck, and what the space between them would come to mean, or about a party in Buckhead 3 years away, where everything I'd been quietly building would walk into a room full of people who decided I was already finished. Talking. I didn't know any of that yet. I just knew that Harold had said pain could make you small or it could make you grow. I was not going to let it make me small. I stacked the last page, turned off the lamp, sat for a moment in the dark, with the parking lot light coming through the window, one thin stripe of yellow-white across the floor. Lighter. Then I went to sleep. Completion. The first office smelled like old carpet and ambition, and a faint trace of whatever the previous tenant had left behind, which Darnell theorized was either a failed tax preparation service or a moderately successful vape distributor, based on the color of the ceiling tiles. $300 a month. Norcross, Georgia. Fleet. A strip of commercial space between a nail salon that played gospel music on Saturdays and a printing company whose owner, man named Gerald, who wore the same Atlanta Falcons cap every single day, Lickener, would become their unofficial building superintendent, their unsolicited business advisor, and, Light, eventually, Lashen, one of Wilson Infrastructure Group's first referral sources, Lashen. Not because Gerald understood structural engineering, because Gerald knew everyone in a 4-mile radius and talked to all of them. That was the whole office, 3 desks. Anthony assembled himself from flat-pack boxes on a Sunday afternoon, with a cordless drill and a YouTube tutorial, and Darnell sitting nearby eating a sandwich and offering occasional commentary. 2 monitors, printer. A printer Gerald sold them for $60 out of his back inventory, which technically qualified as a business expense, and which Darnell recorded with the satisfaction of a man who believes deeply in the moral righteousness of legitimate deductions. Lot Hill showed up 2 weeks later, 27, graduated from Georgia Tech's civil engineering program, 8 months earlier, Lashen, and had been working for a firm in Alpharetta that was large enough to be impersonal and small enough not to pay particularly well, Lashen, which put him in exactly the category of person who takes a below-market offer from a startup, because the alternative is continuing to be anonymously competent somewhere that won't notice either way. Clyde Anthony had met him briefly at a Georgia Tech alumni mixer, and filed him away the way Anthony filed most things, Lockachin categorically, by usefulness, pluck, by character, blocking, by what the handshake communicated versus what the conversation said, Lashen. Scott's handshake had been straightforward. His conversation had been direct without being aggressive. He'd asked Anthony 3 technical questions about load distribution calculations that were better than most questions Anthony got from people 10 years his senior. Anthony called him on a Tuesday. Scott picked up before the second ring. "You still looking?" Anthony asked. "Depending on for what?" "Engineering, real engineering. The kind where you actually touch the math instead of managing other people's contact with it." A pause, a hesitating pause, a thinking pause. "There's a difference. What's the pay situation?" Anthony told him. "That's below market." "Yes. How far below?" Anthony told him that too. Another pause. "Longer. Is it actually interesting work?" "It's the most interesting work you'll do at 27, possibly ever. That's either a great pitch or a red flag. Come in Thursday. Decide for yourself." Scott came in Thursday. He looked at what Anthony was building. Blown, the methodology. Lashen, the applications. Lock-in, the documented results from 3 years of embedded development. Inside projects he'd already completed. Pension inner. And he sat quietly for a while in the way that young engineers sit quietly when they're running numbers in their head and don't want to interrupt the process. Backed up and said, "When do I start?" "Monday." Anthony said, "Okay." Scott reached for his jacket. "I'm going to need a better chair than that one." Anthony looked at the chair. It was in fact not good. Fair. That was the beginning of the thing. Not the company, not yet, but the cellular structure of it. 3 people and a printer. And Gerald next door. And the sound of the nail salon's gospel's music drifting through the wall on Saturday mornings, while Anthony ran projections on a whiteboard he'd bought at Walmart, and Darnell cross-referenced numbers with the precision of someone who treats other people's money like it's slightly more sacred than his own. Completion. The first projects were small by any standard that would matter later. Structural consultations for residential contractors. Material optimization reviews for mid-size commercial builds across DeKalb County. Light. the kind of work that was below the radar of every firm Anthony had worked for, pension in air. Not because the work wasn't real, but because the margins were thin and the name recognition was non-existent, and the clients were exactly the kind of people who needed the service and couldn't find anyone willing to give it to them at a price point they could absorb. Anthony charged them fairly, delivered ahead of schedule, documented everything. That last part was not incidental. Every project produced a paper trail that served two purposes simultaneously. First, it was good professional practice. Second, it was the accumulation of a body of proof that Wilson Infrastructure Group existed, performed, lecturer, and delivered, independent of any individual contract. Client Darnell had been insistent about this from the first week. Pensioner. "You are building a reputation that doesn't have your face on it yet," he said one evening when they were working late, and the gospel music from next door had been replaced by the sound of the nail salon's owner locking up. "Place goes on it. The reputation has to be already there. Waiting." Anthony understood. Pensioner. He had watched Harold Reed build that exact kind of reputation for 31 years in a welding shop, and he had inherited both the understanding of how it worked and the patience to execute it. Flatland, 9 months in, no one outside of Norcross and the immediate DeKalb County contractor network knew Wilson Infrastructure Group existed. That was intentional. Anthony had no social media presence for the company, no splashy website. Lesson. The site Darnell had built was functional and precise and communicated exactly what the company did and nothing else. No mission statement, no lifestyle photography, precise aspirational language, past, services, clown, methodology, documented results, contact information, culture inner. He also had no name on the door. Scott had noticed this first. He'd come in one morning and looked at the door from the outside and looked at Anthony and said, "We're not putting your name on it." "Not yet." "When?" "Later. When the work is so good that the name is the last thing people care about." Scott had considered this for a moment. That's either a philosophy or a tax strategy. Both, technically. Scott went back to his desk. Larson. The first year ended with something that looked pleasant from the outside, modest progress, and felt calming from the inside. Kleinchen. Like laying the foundation of a building that might one day be large enough to need a foundation. Completed 11 projects. Retained 3 clients for ongoing work. Covered expenses with a small margin left over. Pension inner. Darnell tracked every dollar with the kind of granular attention that would have been excessive in a larger operation, and was exactly right for an operation this size. Because this was the stage where every dollar was load-bearing. Partly, Anthony drove to his father's house in East Atlanta on a Sunday in December. Harold was in the garage when he arrived, as Harold almost always was, working on a neighbor's mower at the work table that had occupied the left wall of that garage for as long as Anthony could remember. The smell of the place was inseparable from childhood. Motor oil, metal shavings, the particular cold concrete smell of a garage floor in December. Lieutenant. Harold didn't look up when Anthony walked in. He knew the sound of his son's footsteps. "You eaten?" "Not yet. There's something on the stove." Harold kept working. Pensioner. His hands moved with the economy of a man who has done a motion so many times it no longer requires attention, just presence. "How's the thing going?" By the thing he meant the company. Harold never said the company's name. Not because he didn't know it, because naming things was not how Harold expressed engagement. Asking about them was. "Slow," Anthony said, leaning against the garage door frame. "But the slow is built right." Harold set down his tool. Lekin looked at Anthony for the first time since he'd walked in. Loplinger. That look, fine, unhurried, evaluating without judgment. Inner. Was the specific version of attention Harold deployed when something mattered. "You sleeping?" "Some. Eating. Darnell keeps bringing food to the office. I think he doesn't trust me to feed myself." Smart man. Harold picked up the tool again. "The slow that's built right is the only slow worth doing. Everything else is just speed." Plied Anthony stood in the garage doorway for a while after that, leaking, listening to Harold work, breathing in the smell of the place, letting it settle into him like something he needed and hadn't known he was low on. Bleating inner. He ate the food from the stove, which was chicken and rice and more pepper than most people would consider reasonable, and drove back to College Park. Sat at his desk, opened his laptop, pension inner, and spent 2 hours refining a structural load model for a project in Stone Mountain that was going to be his cleanest work to date. The second year was where things started to move, and where things started to get complicated. Pension inner. The Charlotte opportunity materialized through a contact Darnell had maintained since his days at a corporate accounting firm, project manager, at a commercial development company based in Charlotte, Clayton, North Carolina. Pension who had been quietly frustrated with the overhead costs on a mixed-use building project that had been coming in over budget at every checkpoint. Arnold made the introduction. Anthony sent the methodology summary. The project manager read it, ran it by his company's internal engineers, got back to them 2 weeks later. They want to talk, Darnell said. When? Thursday. They're coming here, Hutchin. Anthony looked around the Norcross office, Gerald's building, the 3 desks, the printer Darnell had bought for $60. Here. Darnell was untroubled by this, washed the windows. The meeting lasted 3 hours. Projecte. The project manager, a precise and practical man named Brian, who wore glasses and took handwritten notes in a leather-bound notebook, asked Anthony questions for the first 90 minutes with the rhythm of someone stress-testing a structure before signing off on it. A. Anthony answered every question, directly technically with documentation ready for every claim. Brian's pen moved steadily. His expression didn't change much. That was fine. Anthony wasn't pitching to his expression, leaking inner. By the end of the 3rd hour, Brian closed his notebook and said, I want to bring this to our financing group. I think we can structure a contract. The number on the table was $2 million. Anthony did not change his expression either. Brian left. Scott, Inner, who had been sitting quietly in the corner of the room for the entire meeting, as if he were furniture that had learned to observe, Bockinger, stood up and said, Ashen, did that just happen? Yet, Darnell said. He was already writing something. Not until the papers signed. Scott. Scott sat back down. He was right to be cautious. Blockers. 3 weeks later, Brian called Darnell to say that the financing group had received information, line, unsolicited, light from an anonymous source, Inner, suggesting that Wilson Infrastructure Group's methodology was unverified and its track record insufficient for a contract of this scale. Financing group was withdrawing pending further review. Inner. Darnell told Anthony on a Thursday morning, standing in the office doorway with his coffee and an expression that communicated he had already been through the first stage of anger and was now operating in the cooler second stage where actual solutions get generated. Anthony sat with it for a moment. Then, can you find the source? I've been trying since yesterday. Came in and sat down. He had a folder. He always had a folder. I traced the communication channel. The information was sent from a spoofed email account, but the originating IP resolves back to a commercial address in Buckhead. He put the folder on the desk. Anthony opened it, looked at the address, and felt something cold move through him that was not quite surprise. Jeffrey Lewis's primary dealership occupied the corner of that block. He sat there for a long time, not long in real-world minutes, Inner. Long in the interior sense, the way certain moments stretch because you're minding something that has multiple implications and needs to organize them before you can act on any one of them. Anger was there, not the hot kind, cold kind, which is quieter and lasts longer and is considerably more dangerous if mismanaged. He did not mismanage it. We're not going to litigate this right now, Anthony said. Inner. We're going to find another financing partner, and we're going to do the Charlotte project better than we would have done it with the first one. Darnell looked at him. Understand that's the harder path. Yes, and you understand that what he did is yes, and you're not going to. No. Not right now. Anthony closed the folder, slid it back across the desk to Darnell. What I need from you is a list of alternative financing contacts, people you trust. People who've seen real work and know what to do with it. Darnell took the folder. He understood. He did not press further because Darnell Cooper had known Anthony Wilson long enough to understand when a decision had been made, and pressing further was rearranging furniture in a room where the walls were already up. Called Harold that evening. Not to tell him everything. Just to ask a specific question. Plan you mentioned once, the one you worked with on the Hapeville job 20 years ago. Victor Bryant. Is he still reachable? Harold said. Victor Bryant doesn't like phones, but I've got his address. You want to drive down to Savannah? Yes, he's home Tuesdays. It was a Sunday. Client Anthony said he'd go Tuesday. He drove to Savannah on a Tuesday morning in early spring, when the highway south of Macon goes flat and wide and the sky opens up in a way that Atlanta's skyline doesn't allow. To Bryant, lived in a house near the historic district, far from Forsyth Park. Plan in a man in his late 60s, who had spent 4 decades in the commercial construction industry as an engineer, project director, then a consultant, engineer, and had retired 2 years ago with the specific kind of retirement that doesn't actually involve stopping work, just stopping working for other people. He was on his porch when Anthony pulled up. Not waiting, just present. The way Harold was usually present, like someone who doesn't need to prepare for encounters, because they're already at the level they intend to operate at. They sat on the porch for the first 30 minutes, and talked about Harold and about Savannah, and about the construction industry in the southeast, and about what had changed and what hadn't, said. You didn't drive 4 hours to talk about your father. Show me what you brought. Anthony had brought everything. Hector read it the way Harold read things, slowly, neatly, without expression. Hutchin. He asked 7 questions. Precise, structural questions that went directly to the areas where a skeptic would look first. Anthony answered all 7 without referencing his notes. Victor set the last page down. Looked at Anthony for a moment. You built this while you were employed by someone else? Yes. And they never knew. They benefited from it. They didn't know who built it. Victor picked up the last page again. Read one section a second time. Put it down. That's either humility or strategy. Habit, initially. Then it became strategy. Victor nodded slowly. The nod of a man confirming something he already suspected rather than learning something new. I know some people, he said. Not flashy people. Not people who want their name on things. People who look at numbers and results and make decisions based on what those tell them. And I share this with them. Yes, they'll want to meet you whenever they're ready. Victor looked at him once more. The same calibrating look Harold had, like father and son had been trained by the same school of deliberate assessment. You drove 4 hours on a Tuesday. Work's worth it. It is. Victor picked up the pages and squared them into a neat stack. Drive safe on the way back. Plot, 6 weeks later. Hockenina. Anthony and Darnell were in a conference room in Midtown Atlanta with 3 investors who had reviewed the full documentation package. Liaton run their own analysis. Come back with a counter-proposal. Pilot contract was restructured. Line, new financing. Partner structure. Adjusted terms that were leaching inner. As Darnell observed afterward with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had been doing this long enough to understand when the universe was correcting itself, meaningfully better than the original arrangement. Project came in under budget and ahead of schedule. Brian from Charlotte called Anthony when the structural inspection cleared and said without any additional framing, we'd like to talk about the next one. That was how it worked. Slowly, then faster, then all at once, completing year 3. Was where the shape of the thing became visible to people outside of it for the first time. Wilson Infrastructure Group moved from Norcross to Midtown Atlanta. 12th floor, glass walls, Hawking Inner. The kind of office that communicates something different than Gerald's building. Better, necessarily, but different. Plucking at the signal of a company that had outgrown its first container and needed a larger one. 47 employees by the end of that year. Projects in Georgia, Platney, Tennessee, Plegging, Virginia, Plight in North Carolina. Pension in a federal contract through a competitive bid process that Scott had nearly lost sleep over, and Darnell had managed with the same unshakable composure he brought to everything financial. Pension in the Arizona Facilities acquisition, which expanded their material testing and quality verification capability in ways that meaningfully shifted the company's positioning in the market, and still no name on the door. New employees learned who Anthony was in their 2nd or 3rd week, usually through a conversation with someone who'd been there longer. The way you learn anything important inside an organization that doesn't announce it directly. He was present in the building, clean a CEO walkabout performative way. Linton, way, Larkin, sitting in the break room with coffee, Lockney, stopping by engineering teams to look at what they were working on, eating lunch with whoever was around. Olshan in. People greeted him warmly. He greeted them the same way. Respect had nothing to do with his title. It had everything to do with the fact that he knew people's names and the projects they were wrestling with, and asked real questions about both. Darnell observed this once, standing in the hallway of the 12th floor watching Anthony in conversation with a junior engineer who'd been struggling with a model for a project in Knoxville. You know, Darnell said later, most people with what you've built would have made sure everyone knew they built it by now. Anthony thought about this. Harold built things for 30 years in Hapeville, and most of the city didn't know his name. The things he built are still standing. Darnell considered this for a moment. That's either wisdom or a problem I'm going to have to deal with from a marketing standpoint eventually. Wisdom, Anthony said. We'll revisit this. They didn't revisit it. But Anthony did privately begin working with Dr. Patricia Johnson. Darnell had been the one to say it directly, as Darnell tended to be the one to say the things that needed saying directly. This was during a period in the early part of year 2 when Anthony had been working 17-hour days for 3 weeks in a row, and Darnell had noticed the particular quality his focus had taken on, not sharpness, light in a more like a system running at full capacity, because it couldn't afford to notice the warning indicators. Need to talk to someone, Darnell said. Not me. A professional someone. I'm fine. Anthony, you're running the company on the energy of someone who hasn't processed anything yet. That works for a while. It doesn't work forever. I said I'm fine. You eat standing over the sink all day. I've seen it. You don't sit down for meals. You don't sit down for anything except work. You're using the work as insulation, which is understandable. But insulation is not structural. It's cosmetic. You understand the difference professionally. Apply it personally. Anthony was quiet for a long moment, Deaconina. The radiator in the Norcross office chose this moment to clank, which was somehow appropriate. Do you have a specific recommendation? 3 names. All qualified. One of them has office hours on Saturdays, which I assume is what you need given your current relationship with weekday afternoons. He took the list, called the third name on it 2 days later, Patricia Johnson, psychologist with a practice in Midtown Atlanta, black woman in her early 50s, pension in UA, who had been working with high-functioning professionals for 20 years, and whose intake process was thorough enough to signal that she took the work seriously and wasn't going to let Anthony perform recovery at her, any more than Darnell let him perform wellness at the office. First session was uncomfortable. Not because she was unkind, because she was precise. She asked him about the divorce. He answered, Lieutenant. She asked follow-up questions that went to specific moments rather than general feelings. Plottins and Anthony found that he had more specific moment answers than he had realized. Plant, which meant he had been storing them without examining them. Litany, which was Plottinina's doctor. Honchen. Johnson observed with no particular drama, very common and not particularly sustainable. She asked him at the end of the first session what he was proud of in the past year. He said the company. She asked what else. Lesion. He thought for a long time and said he was proud of not calling Vanessa. She asked him why not calling her was a source of pride rather than just a neutral fact. Lenchanina. He thought about this for almost a full minute before saying, because I wanted to, more times than I'll admit to most people. And I didn't, because I knew it wouldn't change anything except making me smaller. Dr. Johnson wrote something in her notes. Hochanina. That's a useful instinct, she said. The question isn't whether you wanted to call. The question is what you were hoping a call would give you. Hochanina. And whether you can give yourself that thing directly. He came back the following Saturday, and the Saturday after that. He didn't talk about it at the office. Darnell knew, Harold knew, because Anthony told him during one of their Sunday phone calls, and Harold had said, "Good, blimey, your granddaddy should have done that. Stubborn man." No one else at Wilson Infrastructure Group knew, which was how Anthony wanted it, because of shame. Because some things are personal architecture, not public infrastructure, and the distinction matters. It was on a Wednesday morning in the 3rd year's last quarter that Anthony found the envelope in his mailbox. He almost missed it, Lenchanina. It was between a utility bill and a catalogue for professional development seminars he had never signed up for and continued to receive, and the envelope itself was cream-colored and heavy-weighted and understated in the way that actually expensive things tend to be understated. Bold lettering on the front. His name and address in a script font that had clearly been selected to convey occasion. He stood in the lobby of his building with the envelope in one hand and his coffee in the other, and read his own name for a moment before opening it. Plusin, inside, a formal engagement party invitation. The kind that comes from someone who has spent real money on the printing and the calligraphy and the weight of the cardstock, and wants you to understand that immediately. Leiden, he read the names, read the date, read the venue. A private estate in Buckhead. Then he stood there in the lobby for a while longer than a man should stand in a lobby. Vanessa Carter and Jeffrey Lewis. He rode the elevator to the 12th floor, sat down at his desk, put the invitation on the left side, which was where he put things that required decisions. Hunt his laptop. Had a 9 o'clock call about the Nashville project. Had it, took notes, said the right things. Hung up, looked at the invitation, went to lunch, came back, sat down, looked at the invitation again, Lenchanina. The afternoon moved through him without much friction, which was a sign that his mind had already gone somewhere else, and was working on something it wasn't sharing with the rest of his operating consciousness yet. 4:30. Darnell appeared in his doorway. He clocked the invitation on the desk from across the room, said nothing for a moment, came in, sat down in the chair across from Anthony's desk that Darnell used as his designated space for serious conversations. When did that arrive? This morning. Darnell looked at it without touching it. You don't have to go. I know. There's no scenario where going is necessary. That's true. And whatever she wants you to get out of seeing her engaged to him, you don't owe her that. Anthony picked up the invitation, turned it over, set it back down. I know what she wants me to get out of it. Point. The point, Latinina. Then what is? He thought about how to say this accurately, because Darnell deserved an accurate answer and imprecise language was a form of dishonesty Anthony was not comfortable with. There's a version of not going that's about having moved on, he said finally, Lackadinger. And there's a version of not going that's about not being ready to look directly at it yet. Can't go until I can tell which one applies. And I can't tell which one applies until I go. Darnell sat with this, bleating in. He had the capacity to sit with an idea and let it fully land before responding, which was one of his better qualities in a world that rewarded fast responses over accurate ones. Hochanine. That might be the most complicated argument for attending an ex-wife's engagement party I've ever heard, he said. Also be correct. I need you to bring the Ferrari. Darnell blinked. You want to drive the Ferrari? No, I want to drive the truck. I want you to bring the Ferrari. Separately. Later. A pause. Longer this time. Anthony, I need the option. I don't know yet if I'll use it. Hotchinginer. Why would you possibly? Or stopped. Looked at him. Started again. You want to walk in looking like you look and then? I need the option, Anthony said again. Quiet, final. Darnell studied him for a moment. Lentioniner. The evaluating look, the same one he used for financial projections and for people. Because Darnell Cooper fundamentally believed that the principles governing sound financial decisions and sound personal ones were more similar than most people admitted. Parting. I'll have the Ferrari detailed Thursday, he said. Ready by Friday evening. He stood, moved toward the door. Then Anthony, whatever you're trying to close, make sure it's actually a door and not something else. Anthony understood what he meant. Punch-an-inner. Didn't answer because the answer was internal and hadn't fully finished forming yet. That night he couldn't sleep. Pension-inner. Which was not new. What was different was the quality of the sleeplessness. Not the grinding, restless kind that had characterized the first year after the divorce, but something quieter, Pulchin-inner. More like standing at the edge of a decision and feeling the gravity of it without being afraid. He got up around 2 in the morning and went to the kitchen and found, in the cabinet above the refrigerator, the wooden box Harold had given him years ago. Park walnut, small. The kind of box that sits quietly in the back of a space, until you have something worth putting in it. He'd used it for the things he couldn't throw away and couldn't look at regularly. Not a shrine, but a storage unit for a chapter that was over, and needed somewhere to be. The photograph from their wedding was in there. Auction-inner. He'd almost not kept it, but had kept it anyway because editing history felt dishonest, and Anthony had a deep-seated resistance to dishonest things, even when they would have been convenient. Aiken-inner. The small notebook she'd given him for his 34th birthday with a note written inside the front cover. Pension-inner. A ticket stub from a movie they'd seen in their first month together that he'd found in a jacket pocket 2 years after she left and put in the box without examining why he was saving it. Fortune-A. He opened the notebook first. Her handwriting was small and precise. The handwriting of someone who thinks before writing rather than writing to think. The note was 3 sentences. Lesson. The last one was, "You are the most patient person I have ever known, and I mean that as the highest compliment I can give." He closed the notebook, sat with that for a while. Patient. She had written that as a gift and probably had not understood, even when she wrote it, that patience was a thing she would later resent about him. As if the same quality that made him steady also made him insufficient. Lit. As if the slow building of real things was indistinguishable, from a certain angle, from standing still. He put everything back in the box, closed it, returned it to the cabinet, stood in his kitchen in the dark for a moment. Leakin. The city outside was doing what Atlanta does at 2 in the morning. Quite. Asleep. Fully. Awake. Humming at a register just below conscious notice. Auctioneer. His phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Harold, which was unusual at any hour but particularly unusual at 2 in the morning. Father. Texted the way he talked, seldom and specifically. The text said, "You up?" Anthony typed back, "Yes." The phone rang immediately. Thought so. Harold's voice carried the particular texture of someone who has been lying awake. "You going to that party? How do you know about the party?" "Your cousin Renee saw the invitation on social media. Who texted me, asked if I knew." A pause. "I told her I'd ask you directly. Renee needs to stay off social media. Renee is 53 years old and has opinions." "This is not a new development." A brief pause. "You going?" "I think so." "Why?" Leakinen. Anthony looked out his kitchen window at the parking lot below, lit yellow-orange by the sodium lamps. Flat, a lone car, moving through the lot, slow, someone coming home late. "Because I need to know I can walk into a room where both of them are and feel what I actually feel instead of what I've been imagining I'd feel. And I need that on my own terms, not theirs." Harold was quiet, specific quiet. That meant he was thinking, rather than waiting. "Grandfather had a saying," he said after a moment. He said, "A man who's done the work doesn't need to announce it. But sometimes he needs to see it for himself, just once. To know it's real." That sounds like Granddad. It was. He was talking about a fence he'd built, but Hosseninna. Harold let the sentence end without finishing it, because he didn't need to finish it and Anthony didn't need him to. Litane. That was the particular economy of their communication, the willingness to let the understood thing stay understood, without forcing it into words. "Get some sleep," Anthony said. "I'll sleep when I'm dead," Harold said. "Call me Sunday." Anthony set the phone down. Klein stood in the kitchen a while longer. Alty went back to bed, and this time he slept. Lies not deeply, but enough. Play you sleep when something that has been open for a long time is finally, slowly closing. Light and inner. The Ferrari was ready Thursday evening, as Darnell had promised. Darnell texted a photo of it in the detailing bay. Cherry red, paint so clean it looked almost liquid under the fluorescent lights. Anthony looked at the photo for a moment. Lioniner then set his phone face down on his desk and went back to the proposal he'd been reviewing. Friday came in far, eaten inner. The morning disappeared into back-to-back meetings, the kind of day that has no gaps and requires you to be present in each room in sequence without bleeding any of them into the next, hawking inner. By mid-afternoon, Anthony was in a conference room reviewing the Nashville Bridge documentation with Scott, who had grown in 3 years from the junior engineer, who'd wanted a better chair into something closer to a lead, Licano. Someone the younger members of the team went to with technical questions before escalating. Growth. That growth was visible not in any formal metric but in the way Scott moved through a problem, less tentative, more architectural. They finished the Nashville review at 4:15. Employees began filtering out, hawking. The building took on the particular quality of a Friday late afternoon lighter, already transitioning into weekend, energy dropping in register, but not in warmth. People waved on their way out. Lunch and inner. Anthony waved back. At 5 he sat alone in his office for the last 30 minutes, doing nothing in particular, just sitting, which was something Dr. Johnson had been working with him on, the capacity to be in a space without immediately filling it with task. Not naturally good at this. He was getting better. He put on his jacket, up his keys, took the elevator down. In the parking garage, the Ferrari waited in the spot Darnell had put it in, visible from across the level. Red so precise it looked intentional, like someone had decided what red meant and built the car accordingly. Tension inner. It was extraordinary in the specific way that things are extraordinary when they represent the distance between where you started and where you are. Bartney looked at it. Then he walked past it, plopping to the truck, Clyde, which was in the spot on the far side of the level where it had sat for 3 years. Ocean moved occasionally. Plowen never replaced. Kleinschiner. Acquiring the particular stillness of an object that belongs to someone who hasn't forgotten what it means to need it. Tension inner. The scratched paint. The small rust bloom at the bottom of the rear passenger door that he had not repaired because somehow repairing it felt like revising something that didn't need to be revised. Ocean inner. The worn leather of the driver's seat that had the specific give of something that has learned the shape of the person who uses it. He got in, put both hands on the wheel, playing, the wheel that had his father's fingerprints on it, lying, in some sense, from the afternoon in the dealership parking lot, when Harold had run his thumb along the seam of it and said, "Leshen, she's solid, ugly but solid." The engine took 2 tries, same as it always had, same as it would tomorrow. Hawkin. Anthony pulled out of the parking garage and into the Atlanta early evening. Litty still golden with the last of the light, traffic moving the way Friday evening traffic moves, blind of resigned urgency. Locken. Everyone going somewhere they've been planning to go all week. With it, settled into the flow. He did not turn on the radio. He drove in the particular silence of someone who has made a decision and is now simply carrying it toward its destination. Not afraid, not triumphant, not rehearsing, just driving. Litine. Through Midtown, through the surface streets of Buckhead as the houses got larger and the lawns got wider, and the streetlights became more decorative and less municipal. Parking. Toward a gate that would open to a driveway that would open to a parking lot full of cars that had nothing to say to the truck he was driving. Blind, and beyond that, party that was not about him. Liner had not been organized for him. Walking and would be remembered by no one there as anything other than a celebration. Except him. He would remember it differently. He just didn't know yet exactly how. Lamina. The gate came into view at the end of the long approach, lit on both sides with soft landscape lighting, flanked by manicured hedges that communicated a level of maintenance so consistent it had become invisible. A line of valets in dark vests moved between cars. Liner. The cars were what you would expect. The kind of cars designed to signal everything about their owners before the owner has said a word. Anthony pulled in behind a Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost that was moving slowly toward the valet stand. He put the truck in park. Platt sat there for one last moment. The Rolls moved forward. The valet saw what was behind it and did the particular thing the human face does when it processes an unexpected input and isn't sure whether to acknowledge the processing. Anthony opened the door, the creak of it, the familiar resistance of the hinge, the sound that had been the sound of starting and ending things for years. He stepped out. The valet was young, maybe 23, light and inner. The kind of young that hasn't learned yet to hide what it's thinking. So everything he thought moved across his face in real time. And right now his face was doing something that could only be described as a full system recalibration. Looked at the truck. Looked at Anthony. Looked at the truck again, looked around. Like maybe someone was going to come explain this. Nobody came to explain anything. Anthony waited, patient, lot in inner. Which was something Vanessa had once considered his highest quality, and something Jeffrey Lewis had once tried to use as a synonym for insufficient. Both of them had been wrong about what it meant. "Evening, sir." The valet recovered. Impressively, actually, the professional override kicking in over the personal bewilderment. "Will you be, leaving the vehicle with us? If you don't mind." "Of course, not at all." He reached for the keys with the expressions of someone accepting a math problem they haven't solved yet. "Welcome." Anthony handed over the keys, walked toward the entrance. Behind him, someone said something. Then someone else laughed. Not a loud laugh, the cultivated kind. The kind that wants to be heard but maintains plausible deniability about wanting to be heard. He didn't turn around. The estate was the kind of place that takes money seriously, not in a loud way, in the quiet way which is more expensive. White stone, wide walkways, outdoor lighting, that had been designed by someone who understood that the best party lighting makes everyone look like a better version of themselves. Fountains that actually moved water with intention. A string quartet positioned near the garden entrance playing something Anthony recognized as Duke Ellington, which was the only thing so far that he fully approved of. 200 people. Roughly. Filling a courtyard strung with lights, moving between clusters, glasses in hand. The sound of a party doing what parties do when everyone there has enough money that the social performance is the only thing left to compete at. He saw her immediately, Hocken, in an A. Not because she was looking for him. Because Vanessa Carter had always occupied a room differently than the people around her. Some quality of presence that wasn't about volume or movement but about a kind of gravitational specificity. And 3 years had not changed that. She was in white. Of course she was. The gown was long and structured, and the kind of thing that takes real confidence to wear, because it doesn't forgive anything. And Vanessa had never needed forgiveness from clothing. Her hair was down, the way she wore it for things that mattered to her. And the diamond earrings caught the string lights, and did what diamonds do when they catch light at a party. She was beautiful. He noted this the way he noted structural facts, without resistance to the fact and without attachment to what it meant. For a moment she didn't see him. Mid-conversation, laughing at something a woman in a blue dress had said, the laugh open and real, clocking, and Anthony recognized it as the same laugh from the community center in Midtown all those years ago, the one that didn't calculate itself before coming out. Some things are fundamental enough to survive everything that happens to a person. Then she looked up. The laugh stopped. Not gradually, completely. One frame to the next. She looked past his shoulder toward the entrance, where the truck was presumably being parked by the young valet with the recalibrating face. And she did the math in real time. Her expression moved through something complex, and then settled into something that was harder to read. Corner of her mouth moved, just slightly, and Anthony recognized that too. The same expression she'd had outside the courthouse. The particular arrangement of a face that is feeling something it has decided to convert into composure before anyone else can see what it actually was. He recognized it, did not react to it. Here was the thing about Vanessa Carter. She was not a villain. She had never been a villain. She was a person who had made choices that had cost them both something significant. And she had made those choices for reasons that Anthony had spent 3 years examining from every available angle. Conclusion he'd reached. Somewhere in the second year. Saturday session with Dr. Larson. Johnson, when he'd finally said the whole truth out loud, was that her reasons had made a terrible kind of sense from inside the life she'd been living. That didn't make them right, but it made them human. And Anthony Wilson had been raised by a man who never confused wrongness with monstrousness because a man who does that has given up on the world being repairable. Jeffrey appeared from the left side of the crowd. He moved with the same deliberate ease Anthony had clocked at their first meeting. The ease of a man whose clothes fit perfectly because he paid for the fitting, and who had learned long ago that a room responds to confidence whether or not the confidence is earned. Tonight was deep charcoal, nearly black. Hotch caught the light. His smile, when he saw Anthony, went through a brief recalibration of its own before landing on a wider setting. Anthony extended a hand. "You actually came." Anthony shook it. Firm, appropriate. "You're surprised?" "Honestly, a little." Jeffrey glanced toward the valet entrance, a small movement, deliberate enough to be noticed by everyone within 5 feet. "You drive up in that old truck?" "I did." Jeffrey let the beat sit for exactly long enough, then laughed, just at the edge of what could still be called collegial. "Man, I respect the commitment. I would have traded that thing in 3 years ago and never looked back." Nearby guests shifted their attention in that particular way. Guests do when social content is being generated near them. Different people need different things from their vehicles, Anthony said. Even. No edge in it. Which somehow registered with the nearby guests as more pointed than edge would have been. Jeffrey moved through it smoothly. He was good at moving through things. Well, pension inner. Glad you're here. Come on. Let me introduce you to some people. He put a hand on Anthony's shoulder, the specific weight of a hand that is communicating something while pretending to communicate welcome, and guided him toward a cluster of guests near the fountain. For everyone, this is Anthony Wilson, Vanessa's ex-husband. Came all the way out here tonight, Martin inner. The hand on the shoulder was now a hand on the arm, and Jeffrey spread the other arm in a gesture that encompassed the fountains, and the lights and the Bentleys in the parking lot, and the whole assembled magnificence of the evening. Not everyone gets a happy ending, right, Onjana? But it takes a man to show up and celebrate someone else's. He delivered it beautifully. That's the honest accounting of it, Lartictina. He had the gift of public performance, the ability to say something cutting while making it sound like magnanimity, pension inner. And the assembled guests near the fountain, obliged by laughing in the way people laugh, when they're not entirely sure what they're laughing at. But the most powerful person in proximity has indicated that laughter is appropriate. Bartney stood in the center of it still. Not performing stillness, actually still, pension inner. Because the thing that had happened to him in 3 years of building something in the dark, of making decisions with no audience and no applause and no one watching to confirm he was doing it right, was that the approval of a room had gradually lost its jurisdiction over him. Wouldn't get in anymore. Not all the way. I came to congratulate you both, he said. Clear enough for the nearby guests to hear. Genuine enough that several of them didn't know what to do with it. I mean that. Jeffrey blinked. Just once. Lyle came back, slightly reconfigured. That's great, man. Very mature. Like you. Thank you, Anthony said, as if mature were not intended as a category that puts someone below you. The text 40 minutes were the particular kind of unpleasant that doesn't spike, just sits at a low, constant level, like a frequency below hearing that you feel in your back teeth. Altine. Jeffrey introduced him to people at 3 or 4 different conversation clusters, Platman, and at each one the introduction carried the same subtext, litany, which was, blind, look at this man. Light, look at how he arrived. Look at what he represents in the story of how far Vanessa has come. Lee shook hands. He was pleasant, Hawkinina. He asked real questions and listened to the answers because that was how he engaged with people. Loshen and several guests, who had been prepared to pity him, found themselves in unexpectedly substantive conversations about commercial real estate or urban infrastructure development, before they fully understood what had happened. Klein in a one-man, who introduced himself as a corporate attorney from Sandy Springs, and whose suit communicated that he took that career seriously, asked Anthony what he did. Anthony said he was in engineering infrastructure development. The attorney asked what kind of company. Anthony said, I started one. The attorney asked the name, Wilson Infrastructure Group. Anthony said. The attorney tilted his head slightly. Out of Midtown? 12th floor in the Peachtree building? That's right. The attorney looked at him differently. Not dramatically, just differently. Leshen. My firm does work for one of your project partners up in Nashville. We heard about the Horizon Bridge deal. It closed last week, Anthony said. Congratulations. The attorney said it sincerely, then glanced across the courtyard at Jeffrey Lewis, then back at Anthony. Litonay. He did not say anything else about it, but something shifted in how he was standing. Pensioner. The string quartet transitioned from Ellington to something Anthony didn't recognize. Servers moved through the crowd with fresh glasses. The lights above the courtyard had reached the precise temperature of a party at its full evening warmth, and then the sound came from outside. Past the hedges, past the gate, 3 engines, not loud, measured, the kind of sound that doesn't hurry, which was strange. Because the parking lot had been full for an hour, nobody arrived late to an event like this. That was one of the unspoken protocols. You didn't arrive after the establishing hour, You didn't make an entrance at an event that already had its mise-en-scene arranged. The 3 black SUVs came through the gate in a line. Precise. Flying, the valets, Hawking, who had been standing at ease near the entrance. Pension, straightened automatically, was its own kind of signal. Behind the SUVs, something that was not an SUV, the particular sound of an engine that has been engineered to be heard. Low, resonant, clean, inner. The Ferrari was cherry red, and it moved through the gate the way something moves when it knows it has arrived at the right place and is not in a hurry to prove it. Quartet stopped playing. Not paused. Stopped. Conversations died in a wave from the gate inward, the silence spreading through 200 people in approximately 4 seconds, which is an eternity in party time. The lead SUV door opened. Darnell Cooper stepped out. Locken. Darnell wore a navy suit that had been made for him. Bought for him. Made. Pension in A. Which is a distinction that people who understand clothing understand immediately, and everyone else registers, without being able to name what they're registering. Pension in A. He carried a slim leather portfolio in his left hand, His right hand was free. He looked around the courtyard once, identified Anthony, and walked toward him with the straightforward confidence of someone who has no performance in him tonight and doesn't need any. He stopped in front of Anthony and gave a single nod. "Good evening, sir." The courtyard had approximately 200 people in it. All of them were quiet. Darnell. Anthony's voice was easy, like this was the most natural thing, which for him it was, because Darnell Cooper showing up at precisely the right moment with precisely the right bearing was one of the most reliable things in Anthony Wilson's life. "Apologize for being a few minutes behind," Darnell said. Still speaking naturally, not performing the speech, just making it. Tension inner. The detailing ran a little long. "I wanted to make sure everything was right before I brought it to you." He extended the Ferrari keys. Anthony took them with the same hand that had been resting in his pocket. Darnell opened the leather portfolio. "Tension inner. These are the Horizon Bridge documents. The board meeting is at 8 tomorrow morning, and the directors need your final signature before they can proceed." Tension inner. He held out a pen. Anthony opened the portfolio, looked at the pages, and began signing. Methodically. Completely. The way he'd been signing documents since the company was operating out of a $300 a month strip in Norcross. Someone near the fountain made a sound, quite a word. The Arizona facilities, continued Darnell, collecting the signed pages. As Anthony moved through them, completed the acquisition process. Completing in it. "The announcement goes out tomorrow, after the shareholders meeting." Anthony signed, Darnell organized, and the Texas expansion contract. "That closed this afternoon. Congratulations." Completion. "As of today, Wilson Infrastructure Group is the largest privately held infrastructure engineering firm in the Southeast." The portfolio closed. Anthony handed back the pen. Inner. The courtyard stayed silent for a moment that had its own specific weight. The kind of silence that exists not because nothing is happening, but because too many things are happening simultaneously for anyone to know which one to respond to first. Hone came out. From someone young standing near the side garden. He was typing fast, looking at his screen, looking at Anthony. Back at his screen. "Wait." His voice was quiet, but it carried in the silence. "Wait, Wilson Infrastructure Group." Lechner. He held the phone up to the woman beside him. Her hand came up to cover her mouth. Tension in her. She grabbed the phone with her other hand, stared at the screen, and then looked at Anthony with an expression that had completed the journey from amusement to something more like disorientation. "That's him," the woman said. "Just that." Tension in her. As if saying it settled something that had been unsettled. The wave moved through the crowd differently than the wave of silence had. Lassen, that had moved like sound. This moved like heat. Gradual. Then everywhere. Phone screens lit up across the courtyard. The financial press had been covering the Horizon Bridge deal for 2 weeks. The federal contract had been in the Atlanta Business Chronicle the month before. Plot in inner. The West Coast Infrastructure Conference, where Anthony had given the keynote address without telling anyone outside of Darnell and Scott that he'd been asked, that had been covered by 3 publications. Blind the interviews. The publications had run the stories without him. "They've got contracts in 6 states, someone said. He's the founder, he's the CEO." Tension inner. This from a man in his 50s near the bar, who had the bearing of someone who actually understood what the company was. "We almost partnered with them on the Memphis project last spring. Couldn't close the deal in time." He looked at Anthony with an expression that was retrospective frustration in disguise. "Now I understand why the terms were structured the way they were." Jeffrey Lewis had gone still, not the managed stillness of earlier in the evening. Tension in her. A different kind. The kind that happens when a person's internal model of a situation has collapsed, and the replacement model hasn't finished loading yet. Light and inner. His arm was no longer around Vanessa's waist. At some point in the last 2 minutes it had come down. He didn't seem to have noticed this. Jeffrey's voice came out with a texture it hadn't had all evening, something roughened in it. "This has to be some kind of... There's no way." Fortune inner. Darnell looked at him. The look was perfectly neutral, which was somehow more devastating than any expression that had anything in it. Claimant inner. "I assure you," Darnell said, "there isn't." Jeffrey's jaw moved. Nothing came out. The corporate attorney from Sandy Springs who had been speaking with Anthony near the fountain walked forward a few steps and extended his hand a second time. Fortune inner. "I think we probably need to have a different conversation than the one we had earlier," he said. "No pretense in it. Just honesty." Anthony appreciated honesty. "Call my office Monday," Anthony said. "Darnell will set it up." The attorney nodded. "Absolutely." Across the courtyard, Monica Reed had not taken out her phone. Light an A. She had been watching Anthony since before the SUVs arrived. Since before Jeffrey had started making his introductions. Since the moment Anthony had walked in and been precise and unhurried in the face of being made into the evening's reference point for comparative failure. 42. 2. Locken, the wife of a real estate developer who was somewhere near the bar, Lockeny, and she had a quality of attention that most people in the room were not deploying tonight. Hollingness to watch, rather than perform watching. Hawking, she moved through the crowd toward him. Not hurrying, not making a production. I owe you an apology, she said when she reached him. Haven't met, Anthony said. No, Monica Reed. She shook his hand, firm and direct. My brother works for you, Savannah office. Been there almost 2 years, Anthony thought. Thomas Reed. Something moved across her face. Not quite surprise, plumbing, more like confirmation of something she'd suspected. You know him, he's good at what he does, methodical. Inner. Never has to be told the same thing twice. Monica looked at him for a moment. He talks about the company a lot. The way it operates, the way people are treated. He's never talked about you specifically, but I should have made the connection when I heard your last name tonight. Paused. When those men were laughing earlier, I should have said something. It wasn't your responsibility, maybe not, but I'm saying it now. She held his gaze. I'm sorry, for the laughing and for the part I didn't do. Anthony looked at her. She was the second real thing that had happened tonight after the Duke Ellington. Appreciate that, he said, and meant it. Leakin. She nodded, stepped back. The crowd had reorganized itself around the new information the way crowds do when the hierarchy of a room shifts, and the shift had not been subtle. Lactrinina. Jeffrey Lewis was speaking quietly with 2 men near the entrance, the body language of the conversation suggesting that things had stopped going the way he'd intended them to go, and he was working out what to do about that. Tension. In a blue knee. The woman in the blue dress who had made Vanessa laugh at the beginning of the evening was talking with someone else entirely, and the conversation looked like it was about Anthony, which meant it was probably less flattering to Jeffrey than he would have chosen. And Vanessa, Ontene. Vanessa had not moved from the spot where she'd been standing when the SUVs arrived. Inner. She was still there, holding her glass, not drinking from it, looking at Anthony with an expression that had moved through several phases in the past 10 minutes. And had now arrived somewhere quieter and more interior, something that didn't have a ready social translation. Hawking, Anthony crossed the courtyard toward her. The crowd, without organizing it, gave him space to do this. Watched him come. Her eyes were doing something that wasn't quite the composure of earlier. The glass in her hand was very still. Anthony. Her voice was lower than usual, the register of someone not performing their voice. Vanessa. She looked at him for a moment, just looked, but didn't know. I know you didn't. Why didn't you? She stopped, restarted. You never said anything, not once, after the divorce. Not about the company, not about any of it. It wasn't something I was building to tell anyone, Anthony said. I was building it because there was something worth building. Gleamed to think about this. Her thumb moved against the stem of the glass. I thought you were struggling. I was, for a while. He said this without apology, because it was true and truth was not something that needed softening. Losing a marriage is a particular kind of hard. I don't think there's a version of it that isn't. Awkwardly, but struggling isn't the same as stopped. Vanessa looked down at the glass in her hand. What mistake? Anthony waited. Not just about you, she said. About what I thought I needed. About how I was measuring things. The money, the appearances, what other people were doing. Briefly, Lashen, involuntarily, toward the entrance, where Jeffrey was still in his separate conversation. Inner. I thought success looked like something specific. I was very confident about what it looked like. Inner. You were chasing something real, Anthony said. The version of it you were chasing wasn't real, but the wanting something was. Inner. She looked at him, and something in her expression shifted, the specific shift that happens when a person is heard in a way they weren't expecting to be heard. You don't have to be that generous. I'm not being generous, being accurate. She was quiet for a moment. The string quartet had resumed somewhere behind them, something slower now. Are you happy? She asked. Not as a pleasantry, as an actual question. I'm learning what happy means at this particular level of things, Anthony said, which is a different kind of learning than I expected. But yes. Pause. Leighton. Her eyes filled, dramatically, performing Sington. Quietly, play eyes fill. When something real arrives after a long time of something else. Keep thinking about the necklace, she said. The one you brought home that Tuesday. He remembered it precisely, the velvet box, her face. I said something awful, she said, leaking in her. And I didn't know I was saying something awful. I thought I was just. I don't know what I thought I was doing. You were telling me the truth about where you were, Anthony said. That wasn't awful. What I did with that truth wasn't entirely right either. Tension in her. I stopped saying the things that needed saying. I kept waiting for the right time, and the right time kept not coming. And eventually the conversation we should have had was too buried to find. Quiet. The tears hadn't fallen. Lichensu. She was holding them at the board. Was also something he recognized. Same discipline she'd always had about not crying in public. Precise, muscular control of someone who had decided long ago that feeling things in front of people was a vulnerability she would manage. Leapanir. Is there any way she... Voice very quiet now. I know I don't have any right to ask. But is there any way that we could? I mean, I know what I walked away from. She stopped. I know what you became. Anthony looked at her for a moment. Leapanir. The courtyard around them had the quality of a room that is pretending not to listen while listening completely. Tension in her. The lights were doing what they'd been designed to do, making everyone look better. The fountain was doing what fountains do. The night was warm for this late in the season. Vanessa, he said. And the way he said her name was the most careful thing he had done all evening. Cold. Not tender. Just honest, which was the most respectful thing he had left to offer her. Leading her. You were a real and important part of my life. The years we had were not a mistake. Some of what I built, and I mean some of the actual way I think about building things, came from understanding what it costs to lose something you thought was permanent. Locking her. I'm not willing to pretend that chapter didn't exist or that it didn't matter. Listen to every word. But a chapter isn't the whole book, he said, and I've been writing past it for 3 years. I can't write backward. One tear moved down her cheek. She let it go this time, didn't manage it away. I forgave you a long time ago, Anthony said. Not for you, because carrying it was taking up space I needed for other things. Leslie. Very you answer. Lekina, she said, watching in her. And there was something in her voice that was almost the laugh from the community center, almost, quite, Loshen in her, the memory of it living inside a different register. Probably, he said, okay. She took a breath, okay, Ocraton. She looked at him a moment long, Leapanir, and he let her look. Blockers, she had earned that at least. Plight, in her the right to look at the version of him that stood here now, and understand what it was and what it meant. Tension in her. I hope the next chapter is good. It's going to be. He said this with the same certainty he had when he told Scott that one Monday morning in Norcross about what they were building, not performance, just a statement of what he had already looked at and understood to be true. Butchen. He turned and nearly walked directly into Jason Walker, who had materialized behind him with the truck keys in one hand, and the expression of someone who has been waiting to say something, and has been cycling through whether to say it, and has just decided yes. Truck is in space 7, sir, Jason said. Then he didn't leave. He stood there for another moment with something working on his face. Can I ask you something? Sure, that truck, tension in her. He glanced toward the parking area, where the truck was presumably sitting between something that cost $200,000 and something that cost more. Drove that here on purpose. It wasn't really a question. Yes, Anthony said. Why genuine? Not challenging. Tension in her. Anthony thought about this for a moment, not because he didn't know the answer, but because Jason Walker was 23 years old and asking a real question and deserved a real answer rather than a fast one. Because it's the most honest thing I own, he said. I needed tonight to be honest. Jason looked at him. Then at the keys in his hand. He held them out. Anthony took them. Jason gave a small nod, the nod of someone filing something away, and went back toward the valet stand. Darnell appeared at Anthony's left shoulder, Latin inner. He had the portfolio tucked under one arm, and the particular expression of a man who has done exactly what he came to do, and is now waiting to see what the last beat is going to be. Ready? Anthony looked around the courtyard one last time. Jeffrey Lewis was no longer visible near the entrance. Whether he'd gone inside or was elsewhere in the crowd, Anthony didn't look for him, leading inner. The corporate attorney from Sandy Springs caught his eye from across the room and gave a nod that communicated several things simultaneously, none of which required words. A. Monica Reed was with her husband near the garden entrance. She looked up as Anthony swept the room, and they exchanged the small acknowledging look of two people who have had a real interaction inside an evening that was mostly performance. Tension in Vanessa was standing exactly where he had left her, not watching him with longing, not watching him with regret exactly. Loshen, with something more like understanding, lesson the specific, difficult understanding that arrives when you have finally seen something clearly. And the clarity costs you something, but also gives you something back, Lakana, and you are standing in the middle of working out which is larger. He was going to be fine, he knew that. Vanessa Carter had always been someone who moved forward, tension in her. The direction she'd been moving had cost them both something significant, but the forward motion itself was still there, still hers, still real. Whatever happened next in her life, she would not sit still in it. That was something. Anthony walked through the courtyard, Leishan. The guests moved to give him space, not as a performance of deference, but as the organic response of a room that has recalculated. Holtington. A few people said goodnight. He said goodnight back, not with warmth that wasn't there, and not with coldness that would have been small, just appropriately. Ochanina. The way you say goodnight when you are leaving a place that you never needed to conquer, planning only to visit, block me. Only to stand inside long enough to understand that you had in fact, flying already survived it. Plain in A. He handed the Ferrari keys to Darnell at the gate. Darnell took them without comment. This was the pre-arranged version of the evening, or close enough to it that it didn't require adjustment. "You okay?" Darnell asked. "Yeah." Anthony meant it. "Drive the Ferrari home. See you Monday." "I'm going to be in the office tomorrow anyway." Saturday, Darnell. "I know what day it is." He was already moving toward the Ferrari. "I'll be in the office anyway." Anthony got into the truck. The key in the ignition. The first turn. No, the second turn. There it was. ETE. The engine finding itself the way it always did. Through one failed attempt and one successful one, as if it had decided long ago that starting required a proper acknowledgement of the starting. Pulled out of space 7. Moved slowly through the parking lot, past a Rolls-Royce on the left, and a Lamborghini on the right, and a Bentley beyond that, and none of them registered as anything other than vehicles belonging to people who had made different choices about what to do with money, which was a neutral fact about the world. Plate opened. He drove out onto the road. Buckhead at night had a particular quality, the money in it going quiet for the evening, the streets wide and well-maintained and mostly empty at this hour. He moved through it without hurrying, blocking, got onto the highway heading south toward his apartment, lighter the one he'd moved into 8 months ago. Hocken, not College Park. Clam, a different place. Higher floor, actual counter space. Kitchen table, he ate at sitting down. Plus, something Dr. Honson had considered a milestone. The city opened up around him as he moved through it. Atlanta. At night from the highway, the skyline doing what it does. The lights of it scattered across the dark in that particular Atlanta, way that always looked less like a skyline and more like a grid of decisions people had made about where to put light. Put some light there. In the buildings his math was inside, in the structures that stood up because he'd calculated what it took for them to stand up. Plush and inner. He had a thought somewhere on I-85 heading south that he'd had before, but that arrived tonight with a different texture. Tension inner. That Harold Reed had built things for 31 years in a welding shop in Hapeville and never needed a room full of people to tell him the things he built were real. Walking inner. The things he built were real whether or not the room knew it. That was the entire point. Tension inner. That was the thing that Anthony had been trying to understand in the first year after the divorce, and had started to understand in the second year, and had finally understood, completely, and without qualification, somewhere in the third. The work is the record, Leitiner, not the audience. He called Harold when he was 10 minutes from home. Harold picked up on the second ring, which meant he'd been awake. "How'd it go?" Harold asked. "The way things go when you've actually done the work," Anthony said. Harold was quiet for a moment, particular quiet. "She okay?" "She's going to be fine." Hood. Harold let that sit. "You eat anything at that party?" "Not really. There's soup in the refrigerator I made Thursday. Come by Sunday and I'll heat it up. It's good soup. It doesn't expire. It definitely expires. Sunday, 2 o'clock. Argue with me about soup." Anthony turned off the highway. Hockington. The neighborhood streets quieter, residential through the city coming down to a human scale after the elevated velocity of the highway. 2 o'clock Sunday, he said. He parked in his building's lot. Sat for a moment with the engine off. Tension inner. The same moment he'd been sitting in for years, the moment between the engine's silence and the door opening, the brief space where nothing is required. Lesson. He thought about Jason Walker and the question the kid had asked. Why drive it here on purpose? Hutchin inner. And the answer he'd given, which had been true as far as it went, but which had a deeper layer he hadn't articulated, because you don't stop a 23-year-old valet at a party to explain the deep layer. The deep layer was this. Truck was not a statement about humility. It was not a prop, and it was not a philosophy, and it was not a symbol in the way that symbols are deployed to make points. It was a truck, old, scratched, twice to start truck, that Harold had helped him inspect in a dealership parking lot in Decatur, and had declared solid, light, ugly but solid, pension inner. It had been with him in a marriage and out of it, through a divorce, and through a company being built from a $300 a month office, with a second-hand printer, and Gerald next door playing gospel music on Saturdays, hocking inner. Through the Charlotte deal, and through the sabotage of the Charlotte deal, and through the rebuilding of the Charlotte deal, through sessions with Dr. Honson on Saturdays, and calls with Harold on Sundays, and 3 years of making something real in the dark with Darnell and Scott and 47 people who had decided this was the right place to put their working hours. The truck had been there for all of it, slash and inner, not as a monument to any of it, just as the vehicle Anthony Wilson used to get from one place to another while he was building the life he was building. Night, he had driven it into a parking lot full of things that cost more, and it had started on the second try, same as always. And tomorrow it would start on the second try too, and the day after that, pension inner. And none of that had anything to do with the Ferrari, which was a beautiful machine that he had earned and occasionally enjoyed, and which meant exactly what it meant, and not one thing more. Inner. The difference between the truck and the Ferrari was not the difference between humility and success. It was the difference between remembering and arriving. He needed both. He kept both. That was the whole architecture of it. He opened the door, got out, walked through the parking lot and into his building, and took the elevator up to his floor and unlocked his door and went inside. Completion. Set his keys on the hook by the door. Harold's habit, the hook Harold had installed in every house he'd ever lived in because keys on hooks don't get lost. Changed out of his jacket, got a glass of water. Plushin stood in his kitchen for a moment, looking at the counter, actual counter space, kitchen table, visible in the next room, Putney, and the city visible through the window beyond that, Atlanta, in all its scattered electrical specificity. He went to his desk, opened the wooden box. Not because he needed to look at what was inside, because he needed to put something inside it. He'd been carrying it in his jacket pocket since 2 in the morning, the ticket stub from the movie in the first month, which he'd taken from the box before leaving tonight without fully knowing why. He set it back inside now, closed the lid, put the box on the shelf where it lived. He sat down at his desk, opened his laptop, looked at the proposal for the Memphis project that Scott had sent over on Thursday, the one that had been waiting for Anthony's final review before they moved it forward. He read it carefully. Made 2 notations in the margins where the load calculations needed adjustment, and 1 notation where Scott's structural logic was better than Anthony's first instinct would have been, which happened now with some regularity, and which Anthony considered a specific kind of evidence that the company he was building was working the way he intended. He sent the review back to Scott with the notations and a note that said, "Good work on the 3rd section. Your calculation is better than what I would have done. The 2nd section needs adjustment before we present this. Let's talk Monday." He closed the laptop. Quiet. Not the College Park quiet of a room where silence was something that happened to you. This was different. Quiet of a place that was actually his, built at his pace, furnished at his taste, oriented toward the work he had chosen, and the life that work was slowly filling in around it. He went to bed. And for the first time in a long time, maybe the first time since a Tuesday in late February 4 years ago when everything had gone very quiet in a particular way, the silence was simply silence, not a wait, not an absence, hot shape of someone who used to be there. Just the end of a day. The beginning of what came next. He slept.